On a Tuesday morning in late August of 2019, every farmer within 20 miles of Tama County, Iowa, woke up and walked their fields the same way they had always walked them. They checked the soil, they checked the sky, they checked the leaves for spots and the stems for soft places, and then they went back inside and poured themselves a second cup of coffee and felt, if not exactly good, then at least steady. The way you feel when you know what you're doing, and you've been doing it for a long time, and the world has not yet given you a reason to stop. That steadiness would not survive the summer of 2021, but before I tell you about that summer, let me tell you about the summer that came before it, because that summer is the reason Nora Tesdall still has a farm today, and the reason a man named Dale Crowley drove his truck down a gravel road he had driven 100 times and sat in a driveway he had never once needed to visit, and knocked on a door he would have told you. 2 years earlier, he would never have any reason to knock on. Let me tell you about Tama County first, because you need to understand the place before you can understand the people in it. Tama County sits in the middle of Iowa the way a good flat stone sits in the middle of a table. Solid, unremarkable from a distance, and exactly where it's supposed to be. The land there is some of the best agricultural ground in the world. Deep black topsoil laid down by glaciers and 10,000 years of prairie grass, running 6, 8, sometimes 12 inches deep before you hit the clay. Farmers in Tama County do not brag about their soil the way farmers in other places might. They don't need to. The soil does its own talking in October when the combines roll and the bins fill and the numbers come back from the elevator. The county had been growing corn and soybeans for so long that the rotation had become something close to a law of nature. Corn one year, beans the next, corn again, beans again, back and forth across the decades like a metronome. Fathers taught sons. Sons taught grandsons. The co-op in Toledo stocked seed for corn and seed for beans, and the conversation at the counter on a February morning was about corn prices and bean prices, and which hybrid was running the best test weights and whether the weather was going to cooperate for planting. That was the conversation. That had always been the conversation. The Tesdall family had been part of that conversation for 4 generations. Nora's great-grandfather had broken ground on the home place in 1931, which was, as timing goes, one of the worst possible moments to start farming in the American Midwest. And yet he had done it and held on through the Depression and the drought years and the low prices and the bank scares that came in waves every decade or so. Nora's grandfather had added the South 80 in 1958. Her father, Gerald Tesdall, had added the east parcel in 1987 and had farmed all 420 acres with the same quiet, methodical competence that the family had always brought to the land. Gerald was not a man who experimented. He was a man who executed. He planted his corn on the first Monday in May, if the soil temperature allowed it, and he planted his beans 2 weeks later, and he managed his inputs carefully, and he watched his margins, and he went to bed at 9 o'clock and was up before 5, and in a good year he cleared enough to service his debt and put something back and feel, if not exactly rich, then at least solvent. That was the Tesdall way. That was the Tama County way. Nora was Gerald's youngest daughter. She had grown up on the farm the way farm kids do, driving the grain cart at 12, running the combine at 14, understanding before she could have articulated it that the land was not just property but identity, not just income but obligation. She had gone to Iowa State in 2014 with every intention of coming back. She studied agronomy, which her father approved of, and then she started taking elective courses in entomology, which her father found puzzling but did not object to. And then, in the spring of her junior year, she walked into a seminar taught by a professor named Dr. Anita Vasquez, and that seminar changed the way Nora Tesdall thought about farming at a level so fundamental that it would take her 3 years to fully understand what had shifted. Let me tell you about Nora because you need to understand the woman before you can understand what she did. She was 22 years old when she graduated in the spring of 2018. She was not loud. She was not the kind of person who walked into a room and demanded attention. She was the kind of person who sat near the back and took notes in a small spiral notebook and asked 1 or 2 questions at the end that were better than the 12 questions that had come before them. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's jaw, and a habit, when she was thinking hard about something, of going very still the way a dog goes still when it hears something in the brush. She came home to the farm in June of 2018 with a degree and a duffel bag and 3 spiral notebooks filled with handwriting so small and dense that her father, when he tried to read one, said it looked like the instructions for a machine he had never heard of. He was not wrong, because what Nora had been writing in those notebooks, across 3 years of coursework and seminars and late nights in the university library, was a case for doing something that no one in Tama County had ever done on any meaningful scale. She had been building an argument, piece by piece, the way you build a wall, 1 stone at a time, making sure each one was level before you laid the next one down. The argument was about squash. Not corn, not soybeans, squash. Butternut squash, specifically, and acorn squash, and a variety of pie pumpkins that Dr. Vasquez had been studying for 6 years in collaboration with researchers at the University of Minnesota. Nora wanted to convert a portion of the Tesdall home place from the corn-soybean rotation to a diversified vegetable operation anchored by cucurbits, the botanical family that includes squash, pumpkins, cucumbers, and melons, with a secondary planting of sunflowers and a pollinator habitat strip along the east fence line. She also wanted to learn hand-pollination. Let me tell you about that, because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. Hand-pollination of squash is exactly what it sounds like, and it is exactly as labor-intensive as it sounds. Squash plants produce separate male and female flowers on the same vine. The male flowers open first, usually in the early morning, and they carry pollen on a central structure called the stamen. The female flowers open a few days later, and they have a small protofruit at their base, the swelling that will become the squash if pollination succeeds. In a healthy field with a healthy pollinator population, bees do this work. A bee lands on a male flower, picks up pollen on its body, moves to a female flower, deposits the pollen, and the squash sets. Simple, elegant, free. But Dr. Vasquez's research had been tracking something that was not simple and not elegant, and was costing American vegetable farmers somewhere between $3 and $5 billion a year in lost yield. Managed honeybee colonies in the United States had been collapsing at rates between 30 and 40% annually since 2006. Wild bee populations, the native bumblebees and mason bees and sweat bees that had pollinated North American crops for millennia before anyone thought to put honeybees in boxes, had declined by as much as 23% across the Midwest between 2008 and 2013 alone. The reasons were multiple and reinforcing: pesticide exposure, habitat loss, parasitic mites, a fungal pathogen called Nosema cereani, and the near-total elimination of flowering plants from the monoculture landscape that covered most of the Corn Belt. In a county where every acre was either corn or soybeans, neither of which requires insect pollination, there was almost nothing left for bees to eat. The landscape had become, from a pollinator's perspective, a desert interrupted by brief moments of pollen in the spring when the dandelions bloomed along the roadsides before someone mowed them down. Nora had read Dr. Vasquez's published research. She had read the University of Minnesota field trial data. She had read the USDA reports and the Extension Service bulletins in a paper from Cornell that tracked hand pollination adoption rates among small vegetable operations in New York and Pennsylvania. And what she had concluded, sitting in the university library at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night in March of her senior year, was that the collapse was coming. Not might come, was coming. The question was not whether Iowa's pollinator population would reach a crisis threshold. The question was when and whether anyone would be positioned to keep farming through it. Hand pollination was insurance. It was also, she had calculated, economically viable at a scale of 50 to 100 acres, if the crop mix was right and the market channels were established in advance. A hand-pollinated butternut squash crop on good Iowa ground, sold through a combination of regional grocery contracts and farmers market channels, could generate between $1,800 and $2,200 per acre in gross revenue. The corn-soybean rotation on the same ground was generating, in 2018, somewhere between $400 and $600 per acre depending on the year. The numbers were not close. She brought this to her father in July of 2018. She sat down at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening after supper, and she opened her notebook and she laid it out. The research, the data, the yield projections, the revenue comparisons, the risk analysis, the pollinator decline curves. She talked for 45 minutes while Gerald Tesdall sat across from her with his coffee cup and his reading glasses and the expression of a man who's trying very hard to listen to something that is making him uncomfortable. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. Her mother, Diane, was standing at the sink with her back to the table, and she had stopped moving her hands about 10 minutes into Nora's presentation, which meant she was listening very carefully. Gerald set down his coffee cup. He took off his reading glasses. He looked at the notebook on the table, and then he looked at his daughter. "I need to think about it," he said. That night, after Nora had gone upstairs, Diane Tesdall turned from the sink and looked at her husband. "She's right, you know," Diane said. Gerald didn't answer. But he didn't argue either, which, for Gerald Tesdall, was as close to agreement as you were likely to get on a first conversation. 3 weeks later, Gerald told Nora she could plant the east parcel. 80 acres, she could try it on the east parcel. Let me tell you about Dale Crowley, because you need to understand the man before you can understand why his laugh mattered. Dale Crowley was 58 years old in the summer of 2018, and he had been the primary sales representative for Heartland Seed and Supply in Tama County for 22 years. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had been right about a great many things for a very long time, and that kind of sustained correctness does something to a person. It makes them efficient. It also makes them brittle in ways they cannot see. Dale knew what worked in Tama County because he had watched what worked in Tama County for 2 decades. He knew the soil and the climate and the markets and the farmers, and he knew them well enough that he had stopped questioning his own knowledge somewhere around 2009 and had not started again. He held court at the co-op counter on Tuesday mornings, the way certain men hold court in certain places. Not loudly, not aggressively, but with the settled authority of someone who has been proven right enough times that the room has simply stopped expecting him to be wrong. Farmers came in for seed and fertilizer and stayed for Dale's read on the season, and Dale's read was always the same read. Corn, beans, inputs, margins, weather, repeat. He had a way of summarizing the situation that made everything sound decided, which farmers found comforting, which was why they kept coming back. Dale had heard about the Tesdall girl and her squash project before Nora had planted a single seed. That was how Tama County worked. Information moved through the co-op and the grain elevator and the diner on the square the way water moves through tile drainage, fast, underground, and everywhere at once. He had heard she was converting the east parcel. He had heard something about hand-pollination. He had heard she had notebooks. He was at the co-op counter on the second Tuesday of August, 2018, when Nora came in for a soil amendment she needed for the transplant beds. There were 4 other farmers at the counter, men her father's age or older, men who had known her since she was driving the grain cart at 12. She set her order on the counter, and Dale looked at it, and then he looked at her with the expression of a man who has already decided what he thinks. "Heard you're growing squash out on the east parcel," he said. "That's right," Nora said, "hand-pollinating them." "Part of the operation, yes." The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Dale Crowley started laughing. It was not a mean laugh. That was almost the worst part of it. It was the laugh of a man who finds something genuinely, helplessly funny. The kind of laugh that implies the laughing person cannot quite believe what they are hearing. The men at the counter smiled. One of them looked at his boots. Dale shook his head and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Honey," he said, and he said it the way certain men say that word, not as an endearment, but as a verdict. "You know what a combine costs. You know what a planter costs. You're going to stand in a field and paint pollen on flowers with a little brush." "I'm going to use a cotton swab," Nora said. And yes. Dale shook his head again, still smiling. "Your daddy know you're doing this?" "My father gave me the acreage," Nora said. "Well," Dale said, and he picked up her order form and processed it without looking at her again. "I hope you enjoy your hobby farm." The men at the counter said nothing. One of them, a farmer named Ernie Huber, who had known Gerald Tesdall for 30 years, watched Nora pick up her receipt and walk out the door, and he looked at the door for a moment after it closed, and then he looked at Dale, and then he looked back at his coffee. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. When a man in a position of authority laughs at an idea, what is he actually protecting? Because Dale Crowley was not stupid. He had seen the Extension Service bulletins. He had heard the same conversations about pollinator decline that every agricultural professional in the Midwest had been hearing for a decade. He knew the numbers. What Dale was protecting in that moment was not his knowledge. It was his map. He had a map of how farming worked in Tama County, and it had served him well for 22 years, and Nora Tesdall was standing in front of him with a different map, and the easiest thing in the world, the most human thing in the world, was to laugh at the map he didn't recognize. That laugh would age very badly. Let me tell you about the science, because it is the foundation of everything that followed, and Nora understood it better than anyone else in the county. The cucurbit family, squash, pumpkins, cucumbers, melons, is among the most pollinator-dependent crop families in North American agriculture. A butternut squash flower is open for a single morning. it opens at dawn and closes by noon, and if it is not pollinated in that window, it will not set fruit. Period. No second chances. The plant does not retry. Under natural conditions, a healthy population of native bumblebees, Bombus impatiens, the common eastern bumblebee, can pollinate a squash field adequately if the population density is sufficient, and the surrounding landscape provides enough forage habitat to sustain the colony through the season. But Dr. Vasquez's field trials, conducted across 6 sites in Iowa and Minnesota between 2013 and 2017, had found that native bee density in Corn Belt counties had fallen below the threshold required for reliable cucurbit pollination at 5 of the 6 sites. The 6th site was adjacent to a nature preserve. The other 5 were surrounded by corn and soybeans. What this meant in practical terms was that a squash farmer in Tama County, who relied entirely on natural pollination, was gambling. In a good year, with a mild winter and an early spring, and enough dandelions along the roadsides, the bees might be adequate. In a bad year, a year with a late frost that disrupted emergence timing, or a year with heavy pesticide drift from neighboring cornfields, or a year with an unusual Varroa mite pressure on managed colonies, the bees might not show up at all, or might show up too late, and the crop would fail. Hand pollination eliminated that gamble. It was not complicated. You went into the field in the early morning, before the dew was fully off, and you found the male flowers, the ones without the swelling at the base, and you collected pollen from them on a cotton swab or a small artist's brush, and then you moved to the female flowers and you transferred the pollen directly to the stigma, the receptive structure at the center of the female flower. You marked the pollinated flowers with a small piece of colored tape so you didn't repeat the work. You moved on. A practiced hand-pollinator could work through roughly 200 flowers an hour. On 80 acres of properly spaced squash, at a planting density of 1 plant per 8 square feet, with a typical female flower count of 12 to 15 per plant at peak season, the labor requirement was significant but calculable, and Nora had calculated it. She had also calculated the yield differential. Hand-pollinated squash in Dr. Vasquez's trials had set fruit at a rate of 78 to 84% of female flowers. Naturally, pollinated squash at the same sites had set fruit at a rate of 31 to 47%, depending on bee density. The difference in marketable yield was not marginal. It was the difference between a crop and a failure. Nora had hired 2 neighbors' teenagers for the summer and trained them herself. She'd built a pollination schedule around the flower opening windows, which meant early mornings, 5 days a week, from late July through mid-September. She had established a contract with a regional grocery distributor out of Cedar Rapids, who was looking for consistent local supply of winter squash, and she had reserved 6 spots at the Tama County Farmers Market for the fall season. She had done all of this before she planted a single seed. She planted in late May of 2019. The east parcel went in on a Thursday, and her father walked the field with her that evening and looked at the transplants in their rows and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "They look healthy." Nora said they were. Gerald nodded and walked back to the truck, and that was the conversation. The summer of 2019 was dry in Tama County. Not catastrophically dry, but dry enough that the corn on the surrounding fields was showing stress by mid-July, the leaves curling slightly in the afternoon heat, the tassels coming early. The squash on the east parcel was irrigated. Nora had installed drip tape in April, and it was not stressed. It was, in fact, spectacular. The vines were running 6 and 8 feet, the leaves broad and dark green, the male flowers come in thick and gold in the mornings. The female flowers followed 2 weeks later, right on schedule, and Nora and her 2 teenage helpers were in the field by 5:30 every morning with their cotton swabs and their colored tape. People drove past the east parcel on County Road I-29, and they slowed down. Not because anything looked wrong, because something looked different, because the field looked like nothing anyone had seen on that road in 30 years, and in Tama County, different was a thing people needed to understand before they could decide how they felt about it. Dale Crowley drove past it on a Tuesday morning in early August, and he slowed down, and he looked at the vines and the yellow flowers and the 2 teenagers moving through the rows with their swabs, and then he drove on to the co-op and told the men at the counter that Gerald Tesdall's daughter was out there painting flowers like it was an art project. The men at the counter smiled. One of them, Ernie Huber, did not. The harvest came in October. Nora pulled 22,000 pounds of butternut squash off 80 acres. She pulled 14,000 pounds of acorn squash. She pulled 9,000 pounds of pie pumpkins. The Cedar Rapids distributor took the butternut and the acorn at contracted prices. The pie pumpkins sold out at the farmer's market in 3 weekends. When Nora sat down with her father in November and showed him the numbers, the kitchen went quiet the same way it had gone quiet in July of 2018. Gerald set down his coffee cup. He took off his reading glasses. He looked at the notebook on the table. The east parcel had generated $164,000 in gross revenue. 80 acres in a single season. The same 80 acres in the previous year's soybean rotation had generated $31,000. Gerald Tesdall looked at those numbers for a long time. Then he said, "How much did it cost to run?" Nora showed him the expense column: labor, transplants, drip tape, soil amendments, market fees, distributor fees, fuel. Total inputs, $41,000. Net margin, $123,000 on 80 acres. The soybean margin on the same ground the previous year had been $11,000. Gerald put his reading glasses back on and looked at the numbers again. Then he looked at his daughter. "You want the South 40, he said. "I want the South 80, Nora said. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You decide the rotation." Let me tell you about the year 2021, because 2021 is the reason this story is still being told. The winter of 2020 to 2021 was hard in ways that did not announce themselves until it was too late to prepare. A series of late cold snaps in April, 3 separate frost events between April 9th and April 22nd, hit the region at precisely the moment when overwintering native bee colonies were beginning their spring buildup. The queen bumblebees, who overwinter alone in the soil and emerge in early spring to start new colonies, came out of dormancy into temperatures that killed a significant portion of them before they could establish. The managed honeybee colonies that the county's commercial vegetable operations had been renting from a migratory beekeeper out of Missouri came up 22% short of the previous year's count, and the ones that arrived were weak, their population suppressed by a Varroa mite infestation that the beekeeper had been treating but had not fully controlled. And then, in late May, a neighboring county's aerial applicator made a scheduling error and sprayed a fungicide application on a Wednesday evening rather than the Thursday morning it had been filed for, and the wind shifted overnight. And by Thursday morning there had been a drift event across approximately 4,000 acres of eastern Tama County. The fungicide itself was not acutely toxic to bees, but it contained a synergist compound that, in combination with the Varroa treatments already in the managed colonies systems, produced a sublethal effect on foraging behavior. The bees were present but disoriented, their navigation impaired, their return rates to the hive suppressed. Dr. Vasquez, who Nora had called in April when she first heard about the frost events, would later describe it as a perfect storm. 3 stressors arriving in sequence, each one manageable alone, catastrophic in combination. By the first week of June, the county's commercial cucumber operation, 400 acres run by a family named Borgmann, who'd been growing pickling cucumbers for a processing plant in Vinton for 30 years, was reporting pollination failure. The flowers were opening and closing unpollinated. The fruit set was running below 15%. The Borgmanns had rented additional colonies at emergency rates, and the colonies were present but not performing. By mid-June, 2 other squash operations in the county were reporting similar numbers. The Tama County Extension Office issued an advisory. The advisory said that producers should monitor their pollinator activity closely and consider supplemental pollination strategies if natural pollination appeared inadequate. It was, as advisories go, a model of understatement. Dale Crowley heard about the Borgmann situation on a Tuesday morning at the co-op counter. He heard about the second and third operations by Wednesday. He was not laughing. He sat at the counter with his coffee, and he said what the situation called for, which was that it was a tough year, and these things happened, and the Borgmanns were good operators, and they would find a way through. He said this with the conviction of a man who does not yet know that the thing he is watching is not a weather event, but a structural failure. He said it the way people say things when the map they have been using for 22 years has just quietly stopped matching the territory. Nora Tesdall's East Parcel and South 80 were hand-pollinated. They had been hand-pollinated since the first female flowers opened in late July. Nora had expanded her pollination crew to 7 people by 2021. She had trained them herself. She had written a 4-page protocol. She had scheduled them in 2-hour shifts starting at 5 in the morning to catch the full flower opening window. She had also, in the spring of 2021, installed 3 acres of pollinator habitat along the east and south fence lines, a mix of phacelia, borage, native clovers, and wild bergamot that Dr. Vasquez had recommended as optimal for native bee forage and colony support. The habitat strips were not large enough to solve the county's pollinator problem, but they were large enough to support a local population of native bees that supplemented the hand pollination and, in a normal year, would have been adequate on their own. This was not a normal year, but it did not matter, because Nora was not relying on normal. Her fruit set in 2021 ran at 76%. The Borgmann cucumber operation, 4 miles away, was running at 11% by the time they called the extension office. The 2 other squash operations were at 9 and 14% respectively. The processing plant in Vinton was going to be short on cucumbers. The regional grocery chain that had been buying Nora's butternut was calling to ask if she could supply more than her contracted volume. She could not. She was already at capacity, but she gave them the name of a grower in Benton County who had been following her methods for a season and a half. Gerald Tesdall walked the east parcel in late July of 2021 on a morning when the dew was still heavy and the squash vines were dark green and the female flowers were open, and his daughter's crew was moving through the rows with their swabs. He walked the whole field. He didn't say anything while he was walking. When he came back to the edge of the field where Nora was standing with her clipboard and her morning count, he stood next to her for a moment and looked at the field. "You were right," he said. Nora looked at him. About all of it, he said. The bees, the diversification, the hand-pollination. You were right. Nora said, I know. Gerald almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a laugh that Gerald Tesdall had produced in a conversation about farming in 20 years. And it was not a dismissive laugh. It was the laugh of a man who has just recognized something in his daughter that he had not fully seen before, and who finds that recognition unexpectedly moving. Let me tell you about what happened that fall, because the fall of 2021 is when the story became something the county could not stop talking about. The Borgmann cucumber operation lost approximately 60% of its projected yield. Their contract with the Vinton processing plant had a force majeure clause that the plant's lawyers were already examining. The two other squash operations lost between 40 and 70% of their crop. The total agricultural loss across Tama County from pollination failure in 2021 was later estimated by the Extension Office at somewhere between $2.5 and $3 million. That number included only direct crop losses. It did not include the secondary costs, broken contracts, lost market relationships, emergency equipment rentals, additional colony rentals at crisis prices. Nora Tesdall's operation lost nothing. Her gross revenue in 2021 was $287,000 on 160 acres. Her net margin was $191,000. The per-acre net on her squash ground was $1,211. The county average for corn that year, in a year when corn prices were actually favorable, was $214 per acre net. Those numbers moved through Tama County the way numbers move through a small agricultural community, quietly, from person to person, at the co-op counter and the grain elevator and the diner on the square, growing slightly in the retelling the way all important numbers do, but not growing enough to matter, because the real numbers were already remarkable enough. Dale Crowley heard the numbers on a Tuesday morning. He heard them from Ernie Huber, who had heard them from Gerald Tesdall, who had told Ernie with the quiet pride of a man who has decided that his daughter's accomplishment is now something he is permitted to mention. Dale listened to the numbers without speaking. When Ernie finished, Dale said, "Huh?" He picked up his coffee cup. He set it down. He said, "That's a good year for her." Ernie Huber looked at him for a moment. Then Ernie said, "Dale, she had a good year because she built a system that doesn't need what the rest of us needed this year." He said it without heat, just as a statement of fact, the way you state a fact to someone you've known for 30 years and you're not interested in arguing with them. You're just interested in them understanding something true. Dale didn't answer, but his coffee cup stayed on the counter for the rest of the morning. It was the third week of October when Dale Crowley drove down County Road E29 and turned into the Tesdall driveway. He sat in his truck for a moment before he got out. Nora saw him from the barn, where she was doing the end-of-season equipment cleaning, and she walked out to meet him. He was standing by his truck with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he looked, for the first time in the 22 years he had been the authority at the co-op counter, like a man who was not sure what he was doing. "I heard your numbers," he said. "I know," Nora said. "I wanted to ask you some things, about the hand-pollination, about the habitat strips, about how you set up the pollination schedule." He paused. "The Borgmanns are thinking about next year. They asked me if I knew anyone who could help them think through a different approach." Nora looked at him for a moment. The air was cool and the fields around them were the particular golden brown of a Midwest October. The squash vines pulled and the ground bare and dark. the last of the season's work visible in the clean rows. She said, "You told me I had a hobby farm." Dale looked at her. He didn't look away. "I did," he said. "You told me I was painting flowers like it was an art project." "I know what I said." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The lesson isn't that hand pollination is better than relying on bees. In a healthy ecosystem, bees are better. The lesson is that any farm that depends entirely on one thing it doesn't control, one pollinator source, one crop, one market, one input system, is a farm that needs only one bad year to fail. The Borgmanns are good farmers. They're not bad farmers. They're farmers who built a system that worked perfectly until the one thing they depended on didn't show up. That's not bad farming. That's incomplete farming." Dale Crowley stood there with his hands in his pockets, and he listened to all of that. When she finished, he said, "Would you be willing to come talk to them?" Nora said, "Yes." She said it without hesitation, not because she had forgiven Dale Crowley for the laugh at the co-op counter. She had not thought about forgiveness in those terms. She said yes because the Borgmanns were good farmers, and they needed help, and she had the knowledge, and withholding it would have been a different kind of failure. The kind where you let pride cost you more than the thing that wounded your pride. Let me tell you about the 2 years that followed, because the story doesn't end in Dale Crowley's driveway visit. Nora spent the winter of 2021 to 2022 working with the Borgmanns on a transition plan. She walked their ground in November and December, and she took soil samples and she looked at their drainage and their field orientation and their proximity to the county road and the tree lines that might support native bee nesting. She wrote them a 40-page document that laid out a phased transition from full monoculture cucumber production to a diversified system that included cucumbers, because they had the processing contract and the equipment and the knowledge, but also included 2 varieties of winter squash and a pollinator habitat corridor along their north fence line. She recommended a hand pollination protocol for the cucumbers that could be executed by their existing seasonal labor force with 2 days of training. She charged them nothing for the consultation. Dale Crowley sat in on 2 of those planning sessions. He did not say much, but he took notes, which was something nobody at the co-op had ever seen Dale Crowley do, and which Ernie Huber mentioned to 3 separate people. In the spring of 2022, Nora was invited to speak at the Tama County Extension Service's annual producer meeting. This was not a small thing. The annual producer meeting was the closest thing Tama County agriculture had to an official gathering. 200 farmers in the county fairgrounds meeting hall, the extension director at the front, the usual presentations on input prices and weather forecasts and market outlooks. Nora was 26 years old, and she was the youngest person ever asked to present at the meeting, and she was, as far as anyone could remember, the first woman to present at the main session rather than the supplemental breakout. She stood at the front of the meeting hall with a laptop and a projector and her notebook, and she talked for 40 minutes about pollinator ecology and crop diversification and hand pollination economics and the 2021 season data. She showed the per-acre revenue comparisons. She showed the yield differential between hand-pollinated and naturally pollinated cucurbits in the field trial data from Dr. Vasquez's research. She showed the Tama County loss estimates from 2021, and she showed her own numbers from the same year, side by side, and she let the numbers speak in the way that